Today we are going to talk about one of my favorite reading genres, fairy tales. I want to teach you guys about the different kind of story elements you will find in a fairy tale. One of the fairy tale elements that you're going to look for, you can find right at the beginning when you start to read the story. Most fairy tales start their stories with the words, "Once upon a time." Another element we are going to look for is the setting. And remember, the setting is where the story takes place. In most fairy tales, the setting is either in a kingdom or an enchanted forest. Don't forget about magic. Most fairy tales have some form of magic in it. Think about Cinderella. The fairy godmother has her magical wand, and she's able to turn different things into different things that Cinderella needs to go to the ball. Gives her a gorgeous gown, right? She makes her a carriage, okay? Most fairy tales have a problem, and then they also have the solution to that problem. And in some fairy tales, you'll find that there's groups of 3 or groups of 7. For example, think about Goldilocks and the 3 Little Bears. There are 3 bears in that story. That's one set of 3. And in Snow White, the dwarfs, there are 7 dwarfs in that story. Another thing you will look for in fairy tales is the protagonist, which is the evil, or like the villain. So if we think about fairy tales, and we think about evil, and we think about the villain, we have Maleficent, we have the evil stepmother from Cinderella, or the other one you would look for is the antagonist. That would be the good person. Good versus evil, right? So we'd have the prince, the princesses, and then usually at the end of most fairy tales, they end the story with, "And they lived happily ever after." Those are just a few of the elements that you guys are going to be thinking of and looking for as you read. Now we're going to look at a story that you guys read last week, and we're going to see if we can find some of those fairy tale elements that we just talked about in that story. So last week you listened to the story, The 3 Little Pigs. I want you to take a second and I want you to think about what kind of story elements we just learned about that might have been in The 3 Little Pigs. So the first thing I can think of is that story right off the bat started with Once Upon a Time. So there's the first story element already, Once Upon a Time. The second element that I found was it had a set of 3 because there was 3 pigs. The third element I want to talk to you guys about is the antagonist. Those are the good ones, right? So the pigs are the good characters. And then we have the fourth element. We have our protagonist, which is the big bad wolf. And then don't forget we have our problem and we have a solution. So the problem in this story is that the wolf is trying to eat the pigs, right? And the solution is that the pigs build houses, but not only do they all go to that brick house, but the wolf tries to come down the chimney. And in this version of the story that we listened to, they actually ate the wolf, right? He fell down the chimney, they boiled him in the water, and they ate him up, okay? Now, in other versions of the 3 Little Pigs, the ending might be a little bit different. And in some of those versions, it does say, "And the pigs lived happily ever after." I know our version didn't, but I did put that as an element because in some of the stories that we read, they do. So you are going to read the story 3 Billy Goats Gruff this week, or you're going to listen to it. And then it's going to be your responsibility to pick out the different story elements that you can find that we just talked about. So as you're listening to that story this week, think about the different elements that we just talked about. Does it say Once Upon a Time? Is there magic in the story? Is there any sets of 3 or sets of 7? What is the problem and what is the solution? Is there an antagonist? Is there a protagonist? And then, does it end with "They lived happily ever after"?